We're fascinated by the mindset of entrepreneurs that are focused on changing the world. In fact, within healthcare, we call it the health transformer mindset. And we've codified it. Going back to data, we really believe there's a way to measure the mindset of the entrepreneur. When you think about all the different amazing entrepreneurs that you've interviewed over your career, which entrepreneurs stick out as just looking like and seeming like they think differently?
Gates and Jobs, for the most part. I mean, Andy Grove too, but if you want to, they both fundamentally saw things. I mean, Gates and Paul Allen, of course. I mean, saw the 4404, the Intel, the first Intel microprocessor, and they understood the implications of what it was, and that's when they saw when these things were incredibly clunky. These are hobbyists, toys at best. The Altair, the original one, that was the first one they worked on out in Arizona, but it was Albuquerque, New Mexico, actually. But they saw what the potential was, and were unconstrained by. Gates drops out of Harvard. His parents are both professionals. I mean, it was this. This is a different era. It was. This wasn't the late '90s. This was an unusual thing to do. And Jobs, on the other hand, as well as, I remember I did a long magazine piece on him and his sister, actually, and so what he's done. But he always said his talent was, seeing vectors of technology and culture and where they align to form markets. That was his ultimate talent. And he, and then again, they were persistent and never stopped. I mean, it's easy to, you look back on it, well, of course it's going to work out that way. Never. I mean, at the individual, Gates was fired from Altair and kind of put over on the side and stuff. I remember talking to his original employer. He said, I didn't think it changed, more a pain in the ass, right? And
so when you look at how many other people probably around that same time might have seen similar things,
right.
Let's dig in a little bit to the mindset. You talked about persistence. We call it the long-term mindset and staying confidently ambitious towards your goal and what you're trying to achieve. Why do you think and what do you think it was about them that made it so obvious that, now looking back, they would succeed?
They were convinced they were right. And they were convinced they were right, not just because of a personal standpoint, but because they, again, saw some trajectory in the technology in those cases. That, and particularly in Jobs' case, an ambient culture. Sure. That was kind of coming around it.
Let's stick on the convinced they were right. That mindset around knowing you're right, they've sold themselves,
right.
They're convinced.
Yeah.
Who else do you see with that characteristic today? And what entrepreneurs come to mind when you think about they just know they're right?
Musk. He's the, it's just on that, because you have to have proof points. In other words, if somebody is just starting out, right, who on the outside is going to be able to say, I think, they're right on a big change the world kind of thing. So, and you haven't tested the persistence yet, right? So, it's hard to say. But Musk is, he's well established now, right? And he's through the Times recently, and he was, before he met with Trump, right?
Yep.
So he was, and so there's a little bit on, what he's going to try to say to Trump, but generally kind of about his business. And he's just, he's very analytic. He's got, and as, he made it through that threshold where it almost was going to fail, right? From a financial standpoint, and seems to have come out on the other side.
When you look at all these entrepreneurs, there's some common kind of obstacles that get thrown their way that they overcome. You just mentioned Elon Musk, but you talked about Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. Non-obvious non-brand name entrepreneurs that may be up and coming, younger or earlier in their career, entrepreneurs come to mind that have similar traits that are not obvious that everyone's already read about or reading about?
there isn't the proof point yet on these, and I follow the technologies as much as the kind of the startups themselves, right? I've seen some interesting ones in kind of niches, and partly in healthcare, right? I mean, so there's a Canadian firm, Deep Genomics, where the guy is a scientist who kind of came up with it. Brendan Fry's got some of those characteristics. I mean, but let's see how far it goes. And I'm not a very good judge, right, of how the technology is going to evolve, and whether it becomes an ingredient in something else or becomes one of these, an iconic company.
Sure. But how much of it is the company versus the entrepreneur? So these entrepreneurs, obviously, and their companies, it's hard sometimes to see the line between them. But clearly it wasn't just about Steve Jobs, it was about the Apple as a vehicle, or Pixar, or other companies that he's been at the helm of, or in the case of Gates, obviously Microsoft. Digging into the kinds of people that these entrepreneurs wrap around them, to make sure that they're not just, although they're loud voices, they're not alone. Supportive relationships is the second mindset that we focus on. I
think if you look, I mean, you kind of, it's one of these, once it's a coincidence, twice it's a trend, you see the pattern after the fact, right? But I think most of these people have teamed up with, in economics you call them complements, complementary personalities that, and that have different, complementary skill sets. And so, as difficult as they are individually sometimes, they surround themselves with people who, it isn't like a third world autocrat, even though sometimes they behave that way, particularly if they're very young.
Right.
I mean,
or they tell the story that way.
Yeah. I mean, Jobs, because I dealt with him after, kind of later, and I was overseas when they started the firm, and so I dealt with him in the 90s, right? So, and he said, look, I was 25 years old. I mean, I did some stupid things, right? That I wouldn't do now necessarily. And in fact, the good people all stayed with him, to be fair. But
we call that unique ability teamwork.
Yeah, and it's also, it's kind of, it's kind of like any long-term relationship. I mean, there's a little line about, if real friends are the people you can treat like shit and get away with it. Well, not all the time, but in other words, there's some buffer back and forth on this kind of stuff, because I think they are very, often they have been very different personalities. And it's some of these again iconic. I mean, whether it's Paul Allen and Bill Gates, Steve Wozniak, and Steve Jobs. Bob Noyce, Gordon Moore, and Andrew Grove were very different kinds of people at Intel, right, for example. And I think that those are, and those guys are also, the climate was different. I mean, I remember Andy Grove once told me, this is, years ago, he said, look, when we started Intel, the term exit strategy didn't exist.
Nor is venture capital easy to raise.
Yeah, and some of these, and you made, I mean, the reason why Gates is as wealthy as he is because it was a software company that made money all along the way, right? And didn't go public for 11 years. So it was, they weren't into hock into the investors, right? And, they steered their own ship pretty much. So I mean, so a lot of it is, there's so much more churn in these, in modern startups, and
churn in terms of iterating through their product, or churn in terms of the direction of the company?
The cost of experimentation has gone way down for all the technological reasons we know about cloud, so forth and so on. And so that, and the fast experimentation can happen. So you can kind of move and fine tune in ways that I think you couldn't before, but also you can kind of focus on smaller niches. And then the question is, do you have, you find an early market where you can kind of make a living to keep going, right? And then do you have a more generalized proposition that then can move from there? I mean, the classic example was, I mean, in this case, I mean, Pixar. I mean, that was originally, this is a spin-off from the George Lucas thing, and
It's a great story.
they were selling stuff to the CIA, right? And kind of buying stuff, and poor Lasseter was sitting over on the side making this kind of demonstration model, Luxor, the bouncing lamp you still see, right? And he was sleeping under his bed, right? Yeah, under the desk and stuff to kind of make it going. And then they flipped, and it turned out that this thing was, the demonstration became the business. So but what they had was this, and again, getting back to Job, they had a kind of core underlying technology that lended itself to 3D modeling and then kind of computer animation in a way that, and Lasseter saw that even when he was at California Institute of Technology, I mean CalArts, right? He was, people thought he was crazy because the stuff looked really primitive, right?
How often do you think that technology is a manifestation of the entrepreneur's intellectual property or intellectual capital? In other words, where these become almost an extension of what the entrepreneurs believe needs to come to market or should come to market. You talk about
how much they shape it.
Yeah.
In all of this, and this is, again, it's not like pharma where, the molecule is the invention, right? These are, what I focus on is the IT kind of stuff, and particularly software related things, more so than the microchip, right, at Intel. You're building on these sort of sedimentary layers of things that you kind of then shape. So it isn't, a lot of work had gone before, decades worth of work in both of these cases, right? Computing, it's all ones and zeros to the computer. I mean, you start out with figuring the trajectory of artillery shells. That was the ENIAC, and you end up with Toy Story, right, and beyond, right? And it's all. I absolutely. Let's take both those cases. Absolutely. Taste is hugely important to Jobs, right? And kind of what it looked like, and all these things are sort of well known, as it did with the Pixar. So I think the Pixar movies, right? They were kind of, hardly never had a hit, which is unheard of, as well as taking the time to do it right. Particularly in these kinds of cases, in information technology, it is software is this sort of malleable thing, right? And so it becomes, it was business stuff for Gates, it was something else for Jobs, right?
When we go through each of our mindsets, long-term mindset, supportive relationships, quarterly recalibration is one of the characteristics and mindsets we see as entrepreneurs stepping back every 90 days or so and just recalibrating what's working, what's not working, how do they want to do things differently the next quarter. As you touch on these entrepreneurs, all of them seem like they lived up in this world and universe of macro views of the game-changing landscape, yet dove deep into the details during obvious times in there.
Any of these cases, they were, now the term pivot didn't exist when they were back. They were back and forth all over the place, including, Gates basically selling a product to IBM that he didn't have, right? And kind of making it up. Yeah.
Entrepreneurship.
Absolutely. And Larry Ellison at Oracle was sort of the same way, right, in terms of the original database. But I think it's almost like being a good CEO at a large corporation. You got to do this. You got to do both things. Everybody in your daily life, you're kind of slugging it out in the details, but sort of in the back, there's themes, and you kind of, you've decided what your petri dish is, and then you're doing the experiments in there. And I think it's totally day to day when you get down. It's it's like this whole thing about you don't want to see how the software is made, right? I think that's true of all these things, and it becomes a sort of a straight line narrative only after the fact, and nobody, particularly if you're. I was talking to a venture capitalist yesterday who's funded a lot, fund seed stage stuff in healthcare. A lot of them actually, mostly machine learning and AI, but mainly in healthcare. And as she said, unless you're willing to take hits left, right, and center, and people doubt you all along the way, you aren't doing big enough thing.
Yeah. That's that long-term mindset, being all in for as long as it takes to do whatever it takes to succeed, because it's your mission. And in healthcare, in health, obviously, lots of entrepreneurs get involved because of a personal story, something that happened to them, something they noticed, something that affected or impacted their family. You've covered entrepreneurs even recently that opened up their eyes to challenges or needs in areas because of family members. And the companies exist because of a problem they were trying to solve for themselves. Can you talk a little bit about how often today entrepreneurs are working on solutions or solving problems that they themselves either felt directly or somebody close to them felt?
Yoki Matsuoka, who's now at Apple Health, she had, and this is somebody who was started out as on the track to be a professional tennis player in Japan, right? And her injuries then she worked on prosthetic devices and MacArthur Award winner and Google X and stuff. But she got very ill herself, and sort of went through a diagnosis kind of thing, and that wasn't clear. Young woman, right? She's in her early 40s. And so that steered her toward, now she's in charge of, again, inside Apple. We'll never hear from her again, at least. But I mean, but that steered her toward health. I mean, and also you have, some of these people have the great luxury of, and not just, entrepreneurs like, that made it big like Zuckerberg or somebody, but, so many people have kind of, if you have a skill set that you're essentially you're free to choose to do whatever you want, and those people are, I think, increasingly choosing healthcare, just because it's, as they say, it's the best problem.
What characteristics have you picked up yourself as you've met people and you've kind of admired, either the deep dive or even watching from afar? What have you picked up and said, that's something I'm gonna?
Yeah, no, well, it's the funny thing is, journalist, it's an entrepreneurial demonstration craft, right? Mm-hmm. What if they staying positive?
We call that batteries included.
Yeah, no,
Energy,
look, I work in a field that is really psychologically clean, in the sense that if you're working on a story you really like, that's great, and you're productive. This is, all the stuff about happiness, it's your activities and your habits, right? And, you want to sense a sense of productivity, right, and accomplishment. And, very few things where there's hand craftsmanship in the same, your name goes on it, like the old masterpiece, right? Not that they are, but, and if you're on a story you don't like, they last a couple weeks at most, right? And then you move on to the next one. So it's an extraordinary psychological luxury compared to somebody in some company that's working on a project for 2 years that then's killed. That just doesn't happen, right? So I think persistence and look, the good thing about journalism is that it's curiosity lessons. I've traveled the world. I've seen people, right? And I think this kind of, persistent curiosity is another thing that people who are successful kind of have, and the ability for range. They, they're interested in a broad variety of things. This is, getting back to Jobs, this is what his whole mantra was, if you talk to him, is that, taste. And it comes from exposing yourself to the best that your culture has to offer, and whether that's, that's art or software design. And, those things and your life experience will shape your view of the world. And so have a broad experience. I think you do, and you see people who were extremely focused and narrow for a while, and have broadened out dramatically as they got older. And I think a lot of these the super successful people are kind of like that.
How self-aware do you think these entrepreneurs were and became? You think about their openness to knowing what they know, what they don't know, their coachability, if you will.
It's a very good question, and it's it's sort of suggests some psychological knowledge of which I wouldn't pretend to. even if it's against their natural instinct, that the sort of there's an openness and self-preservation that makes them, not psychotic, right? I mean, sort of neurotic in their focus, right? But open enough
with a tinge of ADD.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, and read about any of these people, right? Or many of them. And to be honest, also, I am not convinced you've got to be a difficult person to be highly successful. I just, it isn't. Those are, it's a little bit like, the classic old English play where, wisdom was always at the bottom of a drink bottle, right? I mean, honest, that's too glib. But I think they all have that capacity to be at some point coachable. Otherwise, they wouldn't have made it. I mean, part of the resilience, right, is to adjust, is to correct and stuff. And if you've ever dealt with somebody who's actually mentally ill and stuff, I mean, kind of what they are, they're a closed loop. They don't have that capacity to kind of see beyond themselves and see. And these, recognizing markets is a way of seeing the world. And if you talk to even, the best, I talked to Sebastian Thrun, who was one of the guys who started and just talked about, because he's at Audacity now, which is, the online MOOC, and so he talked to, it was just about coding, right? And if anybody gets some experience, he said, it's ultimately a human empathetic ability. You have to, put yourself in the place of the machine, right? And do it as it does. And it's that form of communication. So even there, which we think of as the most nerdy, right?
Yeah.
Has, real success. And the best people, I wrote an earlier book about the history of software programming. So it went from the Fortran to the James Gosling at Java and all these people, right? I mean, the best ones, Ken Thompson, Dennis Ritchie at Unix and C and stuff. I mean, they have that ability to go deep and go back and communicate. And so I think that, I think they are coachable, and in some ways, but the proof is in the pudding. You find out after the fact.
Yeah. So we talked a lot about entrepreneurship and the characteristics and the mindsets of entrepreneurs. I want to apply that now to the corporate world and think about the big partners. Outside of healthcare, entrepreneurs typically aren't that concerned with the big bureaucratic organizations or the government. In healthcare, whether it's payers, providers, pharmaceutical companies, entrepreneurs need to collaborate because the last mile into the patient and to ultimately where the money flows is within these big organizations that oftentimes don't have the right mindset or don't have the entrepreneurial mindset. When you look at the organizations you cover, do you believe and do you see entrepreneurship and entrepreneurially minded leadership top down making their entire organization think more like entrepreneurs than big bureaucratic stodgy organizations?
Yeah, compared with 10 years ago, because some of these companies I've covered for a long time. Absolutely. I mean, the question is how much of this is lip service and how much of it is reality, right?
Yeah.
And also how much the top person may actually, genuinely believes that, but how much you can make it sort of permeate the institution. Because they almost fell after the financial crisis, I inherited covering GE, which is a really interesting technology company, actually. As high tech as you get, right?
It's one of our big partners.
But I've traveled around, kind of South, big turbine, trying to make it a digital company, right? So how does that, see that on the ground, right? And I do think that that's one. There's an example where it has permeated down to the kind of engineer level, right? And they've changed some of their practices, but it's a long-term kind of endeavor. And you got to get inside those companies to sort of know that. I just think the whole atmosphere about entrepreneurial risk taking is it's such a meme, becomes such a part of the zeitgeist that everybody kind of feels that, and it coming out of colleges. For some of these things, it's almost you don't even want a PhD, right? Or don't want to go to graduate, any of that kind of stuff. That shows you didn't have the right stuff to kind of go out there and just do it, right away, right? Or if in some fields, if you stayed in, right, at all. But I just think that things have changed so much that, I mean, it's the atmosphere's changed dramatically, but I don't really, you've got to find out individually, case by case, because there's still a huge amount of, I mean, a large organization is going to have bureaucratic inertia, and the effort is to sort of fight it all the time.
One of the big efforts we have at Startup Health is around the same way we measure the mindset of the entrepreneur. We measure the mindset of these partners and how entrepreneur-friendly they are. And for the entrepreneurs to know within an organization where the right door is to go to and the 25 wrong doors to go into.
Yeah.
Which companies do you admire for their entrepreneurial engagement that really are doing things with startups and entrepreneurs that are and should be models for others to follow?
Look, GE is the one I know the best. And it's not, look, it's the nation's largest manufacturing company, so it's not as if, it's a tech company, right? And they've made some mistakes in terms of some of the investments they've made in, like Quirky, right? But that's the cost of experimentation, right? This was a different kind of a crowdsourced manufacturing model, right? I mean, that's a good one. What you also, I think there are markers. I mean, one of the things you've seen is, companies that have, it used to be rare that you'd have corporate venture capital arms. Almost all the tech companies kind of do some of that now, right? That's their way of, beyond their research organizations, that's their headlights into the future. I think that's an indication that that they're more likely to do so. I've seen IBM, do a fair bit of this kind of stuff. I mean, it's, Microsoft has changed dramatically from the company it once was. Largely, I'm more familiar with the technology, moving toward cloud and so forth. But their partnership engagement is very different than it once was. Because it's not just all customers that want to bring people in. So I think SAP is doing some of that. I think Salesforce.
You're just naming all our partners.
It's just, and it's the other side of this. I think is isn't just necessarily corporations. I mean, in the healthcare area, it's a huge innovation arm with Mayo, right, and a lot of spin-off stuff. Kaiser Permanente, I'm less familiar with recently, but have done some of these things. They're not as, they're nominally, a lot of these are not nominally nonprofit, right? But they are ones that realize that they have to bring in innovation from elsewhere. I do, and it's all the usual stuff. I mean, proof of concept. The cycle is just going to be slower, but I think the door is open on more and more of these places, and in healthcare, I think particularly in the policy vacuum. If there is one, right?
Yeah.
Or uncertainty. I think more of these places are going to do it themselves.
Or try to do it themselves.
Yeah. And corporate buyers of healthcare, in aggregation, are going to be innovators as well. So I think they're more open than they once were.
So one of the things we've noticed, we have close to 200 companies in 18 countries in Startup Health, and one of the things we notice is there's companies that are just digital health companies. They're just trying to innovate and move the dial and create a business for today. And then there's these health moonshot companies that are really trying to change the world. Human Longevity Inc., one of our other companies, run by Craig Venter, now chaired by Craig Venter, obviously trying to change and impact longevity and how long we can live healthy years. Much further than we can today. When you look at the landscape around and you meet entrepreneurs and see startups and see organizations working around health and healthcare and well-being, are you noticing that there are now some organizations and companies and entrepreneurs in particular that are really working on big health moonshots, not just building yet another company?
Yeah, I do. I mean, but Steve, you know more about this than I do. This is your world. So I mean, you're there to identify and find them. So yeah, and I do think there's a talent. I mean, there's a talent movement from the tech world. Again, as we kind of said before. I mean, moving into these mainstream areas, like away from ad targeting and personalized marketing and stuff, the sort of kind of sales and retailing side of things into things like healthcare, because I think it's a natural maturing of the technology and the people in the fields.
So I want to wrap up with some conversation around data, actually.
Sure.
We have a massive amount of data about what is working and not working in entrepreneurship around health and well-being around the world. We're seeing everything from business models to partnerships to technologies and mindsets that are working and doing really well and those that are not. And across our whole entire peer network of these almost 200 companies, every day we're looking at just almost so much data that you have to kind of parse back and try to figure out the best way of accessing and delivering the what's working, what's not working. How do you think entrepreneurs should harness the power of being a part of a global army of entrepreneurs transforming healthcare with access to and sharing everything from wisdom, relationships, and knowledge that doesn't exist anywhere else?
Well, I think they're lucky to have the asset, and it's, you start with a kind of, what does the data tell you, right? I mean, you ask that question, right, and you look at things, the resource that is there, and it sounds like, I mean, again, you know far more about this than I do, but it sounds like you have. If you query this data, as they say, I mean, you can ask all sorts of questions about, that address your specific, in your 90-day cycles, what do you want to do next? What are your objectives next? There is a constantly updated longitudinal study, if you will, right, of success and failure in your world, which sounds like, it sounds like an incredibly powerful asset. That's very different than talking to two other people and consulting and a call with your lead investor every 3 weeks or something. I mean, it's a much broader pool to draw from.
Last couple questions. What do you read the most, and what do you spend time consuming the most? All sorts of. I mean, it's just it would be nice to have more time for books, to be honest, but I don't. I do on vacations and stuff. Look, I read The Economist. I read the Times. I read the Journal. I read the Financial Times. We subscribe to them all for old time's sake. We're overseas. So, and then. I follow Twitter for leads. I mean, I look at it as people I follow and stuff as recommended reading, and then that kind of just takes you everywhere, right, to different kinds of. And there's great stuff all over. I mean, it's not just the Atlantic and stuff, but Medium, Wired. I mean, I just and I follow basic research. I mean, National Bureau of Economic Research working papers and SSRN working papers, because in those areas, you can find new research, right? In that whether it's behavioral economics or whatever, and so that, and the scientific stuff, I mind as well. It's just there's the part where it's free range. I mean, it kind of by curiosity and so forth. So I try to read as broadly as I can.